Netflix has officially cut ties with Meghan Markle's polarizing lifestyle brand as ever.
Meghan has got no real income anymore. She's finished.
Right.
The Netflix series is over. There's no great podcast. They don't generate any money. And I don't see where she is going from here. I think she has a major problem.
She and Harry have been a massive disappointment for Netflix.
Yeah, I feel like we had this on our 2026 bingo card. It was a significant disappointment to the streamer, and with
Meghan off.
What's the title of her show? Love Meghan. For what to watch? Who wants to watch Meghan Markle bake a pie?
Oh.
My name is Megan Sussex now. Call me Meghan Markle one more time, Mindy f***ing Kaling.
Your half-sister, has just lost her $100 million Netflix contract. What do you think?
Something big just happened behind closed doors at Netflix, and the silence around it is raising serious questions. The streaming giant has officially pulled the plug on its deal with Meghan Markle, and insiders are asking the same thing everyone else is wondering: what really went down behind the scenes? Because when a platform that once promoted you everywhere suddenly steps back without a fight, that's not just business. That's a message.
I'm gonna miss their latent fear in interacting with her, that they say something wrong, like call her Meghan Markle instead of it's Sussex now, and just her latent anger underneath every interaction.
Before anyone even started using the word canceled, something far more revealing happened. Nothing. No outrage, no big defense campaigns online, no wave of supporters rushing in. When Meghan's Netflix project quietly slipped out of the conversation, industry watchers noticed something strange. It wasn't collapsing numbers or brutal reviews that stood out. It was the sudden absence of urgency. Almost like the platform itself had stopped trying to explain why the show mattered in the first place. And that's where this story really begins. Not with critics tearing it apart or trolls celebrating online, but with Netflix slowly checking out.
I don't think anybody at Netflix could have seen the show before it went out, because it's not entertainment, it's not edifying in any way. It's really, really bizarre.
Everything she touches turns to shit. And I think every sort of creative person behind her or deep pocket behind her knows it's an extraordinary risk. She's too toxic to touch.
The excitement cooled, the push disappeared, and behind the scenes, it felt like the company had already emotionally clocked out. Right around that moment, royal biographer Tom Bower stepped back into the spotlight. But instead of accusing Meghan of lying or exaggerating, he dropped a far more uncomfortable claim. According to Bower, the real issue wasn't truth at all. It was timing. Emotional timing, repetition, public fatigue, and the sense that audiences had simply heard the same story too many times. While that quiet disengagement was unfolding behind closed doors, Prince Harry seemed to be unraveling somewhere else entirely.
And to hear them claim in their defense that I don't have any right to privacy is disgusting. They have made my wife's life an absolute misery, my lord.
No one expected a courtroom moment like this. He wasn't just arguing facts or law in Itasis, he was reliving years of personal history out loud. Almost like unresolved frustration had finally found a microphone that couldn't be cut off. And that's when the narrative started to fracture. Because this was never just about a show, a lawsuit, or even public sympathy.
Why? Why are you doing this? Why are you demeaning yourself in this fashion? Because Meghan has hired a house which is supposedly worth between £5 million and £10 million. And she's got her famous friends, except of course none of us will have heard of her famous friends, so they're not that famous friends. And she's giving all these really bizarre and quite cryptic guides on how to be the perfect hostess.
It became a story about what happens when vulnerability begins to feel curated, when relevance fades through corporate decisions, and when the people telling the story slowly lose control of how it's framed. The first real warning sign wasn't a headline. It was what didn't happen after release. No second wave of promotion, no executives stepping out to defend the vision, no major push across the homepage. Inside streaming platforms, failure rarely explodes loudly. It drifts. Projects that spark belief usually get protected, reframed, re-edited, reintroduced. But this one wasn't. The energy around it cooled almost immediately, like the enthusiasm had already been spent long before the audience even arrived.
Well, I think it was inevitable, and I've seen this coming for a long time based on the very few times that I actually watched 5 minutes of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 episodes, and it just struck me as completely empty, completely fake, and I knew it was only a matter of time before this would happen.
Just because you marry a prince doesn't mean you can become a lifestyle guru. She really thought in a way she could just sort of, rock up and become the new Martha Stewart, and the problem is she's inauthentic, and people have to like you to want to go into your TV kitchen or your mate's kitchen or whatever it is.
What really shook people inside the industry wasn't whether audiences liked the show or not. It was how fast the conversation inside Netflix moved on. One week, the project was being discussed, and the next week, it was like it vanished from the room. Meetings shifted topics, talking points disappeared, and suddenly nobody volunteered to explain the project anymore. That's not the loud drama of cancellation. That's quiet disengagement. And disengagement usually starts when a platform can't answer one simple question anymore. Who exactly is this for right now? The show didn't spark outrage, and it didn't collapse under criticism. It simply landed at the wrong emotional moment.
People aren't watching it. I mean, it's an effort to watch a single episode because each episode is 40 minutes long. And you've got to have a lot more interest in Meghan Sussex.
What mother or father in the name of sweet Jesus has enough time to create a fruit plate at 6 o'clock on a Monday morning when there's toast throwing around the room? And her kitchen was just sterile and awful. And I hate her. I'm so sorry. I really do.
It's the biggest piece of dog shit.
Viewers weren't angry enough to argue about it, and they weren't moved enough to defend it either. So they did the one thing streaming platforms fear the most. They kept scrolling. For a company built around retention and engagement, that reaction is brutal. Indifference gives algorithms nothing to work with. No controversy, no momentum, no spike of attention, just a flat line. And when that happens, platforms rarely pull the plug in a dramatic way. Instead, they slowly step back. Projects stop getting mentioned, meetings stop asking what's next, and momentum quietly disappears. The moment a system stops needing you to explain your work, it has already started moving on.
What Meghan never really understood, probably not even now, is that when she was cheered as a working royal, it wasn't because she was Meghan Markle, it was because she represented British royalty and all the values of the Queen and all the tradition and 1,000 years of history.
That's where royal biographer Tom Bauer stepped in and changed the whole tone of the conversation. He didn't question facts, he didn't accuse Meghan of deception, and he didn't claim the emotions were fake. Instead, he raised a much more uncomfortable possibility. The message arrived out of sync. According to Bauer, the problem wasn't the feelings themselves, it was how they were presented. His argument was simple, but unsettling. The emotions felt delivered with the precision of a performance, rather than the unpredictability of real life. Viewers didn't necessarily question whether the feelings were genuine. What they questioned was why everything appeared so carefully structured and perfectly timed. That difference matters more than people think.
Other Meghan Markle, with Love Meghan, her show, your show's doing great. Her show was canceled. She said it was just a lot of work to do. What will you miss? What will you miss most about the show? Because I know you watched religiously.
I think it's going to be the terrified friends who, come in and they have to pretend that they all know each other really well and that she knows them really well. Like Daniel, the makeup artist, who clearly she doesn't know it all. He knows all her BS, but she doesn't know anything about him. He's been in a couple episodes, and then finally she'll be like, "Oh, do you have a boyfriend? Or do you have kids?" It's like these are things you would know if this were actually your.
Authenticity isn't judged only by honesty. It's also judged by friction, hesitation, and moments that feel messy or unresolved. When vulnerability appears too polished, too carefully balanced, audiences naturally step back, not with anger, but with doubt. The stories didn't feel like they were unfolding naturally. They arrived already shaped, emotionally resolved, and neatly explained. Nothing was left hanging for viewers to wrestle with themselves.
It comes the first time in her life that Meghan Markle actually touches food. Let's watch that back. Why is she pushing apples into the salad? Oh dear, even her hands can't do acting.
They're living this extravagant lifestyle, pretending that they're just completely irrelevant when it comes to money and spending, like they just have endless amounts, but it's pretty obvious. I mean, staff quitting, staff getting fired continuously.
And when every emotion is packaged and clarified, nothing lingers in the mind. That shift reframed the entire reaction. What many people felt wasn't betrayal, it was fatigue, a sense that they were being asked to emotionally invest in something that had already been fully processed, edited, and delivered with a clear message attached. Once vulnerability starts sounding more like a thesis than a confession, the connection weakens, not because the story is untrue, but because it stops feeling discovered in real time. The emotional distance grows quietly. And honestly, what Tom Bauer said really hit a nerve.
Rather than actually specifically answer them, he kept saying, it's disgusting what they did to us. It's disgraceful. It's disgraceful. And in the end, the judge said, look, it's not your job to emote. It's not your job to tell us here on the stand. It's not your job to tell us whether you think this behavior is disgusting or not. It is your job to specifically answer the questions you are asked.
Look, I'm not saying their emotions were fake, but the presentation that became the problem. It's almost like seeing perfectly curated sadness on social media. The feelings might be real, but they're also carefully managed, and audiences can feel that difference immediately. Most people have experienced that moment themselves, when something feels just a little too polished to be spontaneous. The real turning point wasn't actually a scene that aired. It was something viewers noticed outside the frame. While the show highlighted warmth, reflection, and emotional clarity,
Everything about her is fraudulent, right? These are not real friendships. We all know that. These are not her recipes. Pouring pretzels from the store-bought bag into a cellophane bag is not a real piece of advice for people on how to make things feel more homegrown.
people started noticing a quiet gap between what was discussed on screen and what remained untouched off camera. Not as an accusation, but as a noticeable absence. There was no visible pause in production, no moment of reflection addressing the deeper tensions that everyone already knew existed. That absence became louder with every carefully framed scene. For many viewers, that silence mattered more than anything that was said directly.
And then even season 2 of her show was fake. It was not a season 2, it was a lie. She did an original, 12 episodes I think it was, and they just cut them in half. They aired the first 6, and then as soon as it was done, she said, I've been renewed for a second season. It's like, no, they bought 12 episodes and you sliced it. What do you, everybody knows?
Slowly, the storytelling began to feel compartmentalized. Emotions appeared in neat, safe sections where everything could stay controlled. Meanwhile, the more uncomfortable realities remained sealed away from the cameras. Audiences didn't interpret this as cruelty or deception. They interpreted it as emotional management. And that subtle distinction changed the way everything was viewed. People don't expect complete transparency from public figures. Everyone understands boundaries. But when a story promises intimacy while avoiding the most complicated tension surrounding it, viewers inevitably start noticing the gap between what's shown and what remains just out of frame.
The authenticity is really what the issue is, and there's, just hired a whole new PR firm and the whole thing. I think if you just tell people as it is, your bumps, your bruises, they forgive and accept. Like, for example, Charlie Sheen. Why can that guy step in shit all over the place, over and over again, and still be liked by people? Because he's the first guy to be like, yeah, it was me, and he just owns it all. And in Meghan's case, it seems to me she's absolutely determined to force feed the narrative, and damn it, they're going to accept it and keep going, and people are just too smart.
She thinks she's fooling us, and she never is. You can tell just the way she's artificially building herself up with like the humble brags that she constantly does. She's so incredibly needy. Like, I can't even be around it as a consumer. I can't imagine how Harry handles this as a full-time partner.
Trust rarely collapses all at once. It erodes slowly, almost quietly, until the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Not because viewers demand answers, but because silence starts changing how everything is interpreted. What once felt reflective began to feel selective. Not manipulative, but calculated. And public perception doesn't wait patiently for nuance or private explanations. It reacts to contrast, to what's being shown versus what's quietly left out. By the time critics finally put it into words, most viewers had already sensed it. Something didn't feel missing from the story. It felt stepped around. And that realization didn't ignite outrage. It triggered reinterpretation. Suddenly, the entire project carried a cooler tone, less confession and more containment. As that understanding settled in, something very different was unfolding far from the cameras and far outside the control of any production team. When Prince Harry walked into that courtroom, the atmosphere shifted instantly. This didn't feel like a routine legal proceeding. It felt deeply personal. Observers expected technical arguments, legal points, timelines, evidence. Instead, they watched something closer to emotional excavation. Harry's answers carried a weight that didn't belong to just one case. They sounded layered, almost accumulated, like years of unresolved memories had been compressed into a single moment that finally couldn't be sidestepped. He wasn't simply responding to questions, he was reliving them. Every answer felt less like legal strategy and more like emotional release. Not explosive, not chaotic, just heavy. The kind of weight that suggests something has been carried for years without a real outlet. Inside that courtroom, restraint didn't explode dramatically. It cracked slowly, but visibly. And that visibility mattered, because for the first time in a long while, the emotion didn't appear carefully packaged or guided by a narrative structure. There were no dramatic edits, no music swelling in the background, no polished framing language to soften the moment. Just raw responses landing unevenly in a room designed for precision, not emotion. And because of that, the coverage started shifting. Commentators stopped focusing purely on the legal outcome and began circling something deeper. The sense that this moment wasn't about a courtroom victory or a headline. It was about unresolved history demanding recognition. That's what made the moment feel unsettling. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it felt overdue. Compared to the polished storytelling audiences had seen elsewhere, this moment felt unfiltered in a way viewers hadn't experienced before. And that raised a quiet but uncomfortable question. If this is what genuine, uncontained emotion looks like, then what had everything else been? That question followed the story into its next stage, where public perception began to harden. By this point, the issue wasn't exposure anymore. It was pattern. Across memoirs, interviews, documentaries, and long-form projects, a rhythm had started forming. Personal revelations appearing at carefully spaced intervals, emotional disclosures delivered with precision, followed by silence until the next moment arrived. Nothing seemed accidental, and strangely, that precision became the real problem. People rarely reject vulnerability because it's overwhelming. What makes them pull away is when emotion starts to feel scheduled. When sadness or confession arrives polished, controlled, and perfectly timed instead of messy or uncertain. When every emotional moment feels pre-approved, explained, and ready for the audience to consume, the public doesn't feel overwhelmed. They feel managed. And that shift changes everything, because once viewers start sensing they're being guided toward a specific emotional response, empathy begins to fade quietly, not through anger or protest, but through distance. The stories still carried weight, but they stopped surprising people. Each new reveal felt less like discovery and more like continuation. Another chapter landing exactly where everyone expected it to. An expectation in a story built around emotion can be dangerous. When vulnerability becomes predictable, it starts losing its power. Without friction, there's no tension. And without tension, the audience has nothing emotional to hold on to. That's where the narrative quietly began to shift, from resistance to maintenance, from rebellion to simply protecting a position. What once felt like breaking free started looking more like sustaining an image. Not dishonest, not necessarily fake, but engineered. And once something feels engineered, intimacy drains fast. By the time that realization settled in, the reaction wasn't explosive. Engagement didn't collapse overnight. Instead, viewership softened, interest cooled, and the energy around the project faded quietly. Because when emotion begins to feel like part of a rollout, audiences rarely argue about it. They simply step back. And that quiet step back would soon become something bigger. Institutional disengagement. Decline almost never arrives with dramatic rejection. It arrives as administration. No clear no dramatic fallout. Just subtle changes in priority. Projects stop getting fast-tracked. Responses take longer. Conversations lose urgency. Not because anyone is furious, but because attention has shifted somewhere else. In systems built around relevance, speed equals belief, and belief had clearly started moving on. This is the stage most people never notice. From the outside, everything still appears intact. Contracts still exist, relationships remain polite, public appearances continue. But inside the system, the urgency is gone. The work is no longer defended. It's no longer framed as essential. It simply becomes optional. And optional in an industry built on momentum is fatal. What makes this phase so chilling is how invisible it is. There's no headline for delayed replies, no article announcing postponed meetings or quiet hesitation. When enthusiasm disappears, it happens silently, behind phrases like, "We'll revisit this," "Let's circle back," or "Timing is complicated." Those phrases don't sound like endings, but they are. This is exactly the kind of shift Tom Bauer hinted at without dramatizing it. Not collapse, not exile, just detachment. A system slowly reorganizing itself without you at the center. And by the time that realization hits, the transition is already finished. Because institutions rarely cut ties overnight. They loosen them gradually until they fall away on their own. That's the strategy. And the most frustrating part? There's nothing obvious to fight. No villain, no clear decision to challenge, no dramatic announcement to rally supporters around. Just the quiet awareness that doors aren't slamming shut. They simply aren't being opened anymore. That's when relevance stops being debated publicly and starts being managed privately. And that's exactly why this story refuses to disappear. Not because people are furious, not because the public is choosing sides, but because something recognizable is unfolding in real time. Audiences aren't watching out of loyalty anymore. They're watching out of curiosity. People want to understand what happens when a narrative stops controlling how it's received, when the audience no longer wants to be guided, persuaded, or emotionally directed. What's driving attention now isn't outrage, it's recognition. Viewers are seeing a broader pattern that feels familiar. The exhaustion of constantly being told how to interpret emotion, the quiet pushback against stories that arrive already packaged and emotionally concluded. This story taps directly into that fatigue, not as a spectacle, but as a case study. Every new development isn't consumed purely for drama anymore. It's analyzed for signals. What does this reveal about credibility, about attention, about how quickly influence can thin once it stops feeling organic? That's why engagement continues even as passion fades, because people aren't invested in the outcome anymore. They're invested in the process. They're watching how relevance dissolves without conflict, how influence weakens without confrontation. It's a uniquely modern unraveling. No villain, no redemption arc, just drift. And drift is unsettling because it offers no clean ending. There's no final moment where everything concludes neatly. The story simply keeps going, lighter each time, carrying less weight with every appearance. And strangely, that's what keeps people clicking. Not the anticipation of chaos, but curiosity about erosion. People want to see what remains once emotional authority fades and the audience quietly steps back. And in that quiet space, something irreversible happens. The story doesn't end. It simply stops leading. Once that happens, the next chapter belongs to the observers, not the subjects. So what's the real takeaway here? In my view, it's simple. Authenticity can't be forced, no matter how vulnerable someone appears. If audiences sense calculation behind it, that emotional connection struggles to form. And honestly, this isn't just Meghan and Harry's story. It reflects a much bigger shift happening everywhere. We're living in an era where vulnerability itself has become content. Creators, celebrities, influencers, everyone is learning the same lesson. Audiences are getting sharper at spotting the difference between sharing and presenting, between honesty and performance. And by the time everything settles, there probably won't be a dramatic collapse to point to. No explosive finale, no shocking statement, just a quiet shift in attention that already feels complete. What this story reveals isn't failure in the traditional sense. It's something far more modern. Influence doesn't disappear when people turn against you. It fades when they stop leaning in. That's the real turning point, because once a narrative loses its ability to shape how it's received, everything becomes reactive. Every appearance carries less gravity. Every response lands softer, and eventually even major moments struggle to command real attention. But if you want to see where that loss of control suddenly became impossible to ignore, the answer isn't on a streaming platform. It happened inside a courtroom, a moment where emotions spilled out without filters, where years of frustration about perceived injustice surfaced all at once. Observers say the tension grew so intense that even the judge stepped in with a rare warning as things escalated. And when Harry's legal team abruptly walked away, the atmosphere inside that room reportedly shifted completely. That moment revealed just how much pressure had already been building behind the scenes. So, if you want the full context of how that confrontation unfolded, the audition, and why many believe it changed everything, watch the video linked next. This is Whispers of Fame, where influence gets tested, narratives start unraveling, and the truth often lives somewhere between the headlines.